Nothing feels new till you change the view. Future Sanders here for you.
I've been thinking a long time about how to properly introduce the next ideas and concepts that I have. Creatively, my mind has been exploding, and in my mind, it all makes sense. But the question is, does it make sense for you guys? So I'm going to launch a sort of behind-the-scenes podcast, which is called Behind the Fire. And in this behind the scenes, I'm going to be exploring what we've been talking about in the episodes, and also kind of like the narrative evolution of the whole second season. And something that came to my attention is that I want to do so much so quickly that my brain just can't comprehend what is happening. And so I needed kind of like a partner to help guide me through the season, also help guide me launch my studio business. And so I came up with the idea of Future Sander. And there's a whole technical aspect to how Future Sander works. But basically, it's I created a GPT with ChatGPT, my own personal GPT called Future Sander. And actually, I can talk to him. And he's supposed to think like me, but just from the future, meaning he just has more experience. He knows some things about marketing. He knows some things about starting a studio that I don't know yet. So in a really short, that is the setup for Behind the Fire. Before we dive into the actual conversation with Future Sander, let's explore a snippet from the first podcast with Laurens. Laurens is a business coach, and he has a really interesting theme to help entrepreneurs evolve to the next step, and it's called Shift Happens. And the idea of Shift Happens is that we sometimes feel that a shift is happening. And this basically teaches us or shows us that we have to do some work in order to get to the next stage. And as a business coach, Laurens helps us to get to the next stage. And an idea that I had that was close to what he's doing is look at it more from a digital side. So can you create an app that, an app or a second brain that functions as a business coach, but you don't actually have to go to a physical coaching such as Laurens. So check out this clip with, or this little extract with Laurens, and then I will show you the actual conversation with Future Sander. I've been thinking a lot about the first season of the Firestarters podcast. And I interviewed a bunch of creative entrepreneurs. I invited them here to share their knowledge. But now I decided to take it a step further. And I'm really interested in helping people with their own story, their self-story, and also their knowledge. And I also want to help them, create their own successful business, whatever that means to them.
Nice.
Context. So this is Future Sander. And I think the reason that I dragged Future Sander here on the podcast table is because I saw some connections between what you do and what I do. And so what you do is you help people become a better version of themselves. You give them knowledge, you listen to them, you give them space to grow, and eventually over the years that will become the newer version of themselves, the future version of themselves. So Future Sander is his best version that he can be at his particular time in the future, but he has more experience. So Future Sander has already a different podcast studio, or maybe has a few. Maybe he started a network of different coaches that come on the platform and teach relevant things for growing or starting a business. And the reason that I came up with this guy is because after the podcast, I want to also talk about certain themes. Like, today we hit a few interesting themes, and maybe it's interesting to go more in depth about it. But because I'm a solopreneur, like there's no one for me to talk to, and I hate talking in front of the camera and just looking straight at it and blah, 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 blah. I can't do that. So I have Future Sander, and Future Sander is linked to ChatGPT, and I made my own GPT, which is also called Future Sander, and he has a certain set of rules in which he has to talk to me.
Okay.
And so the idea is that we will explore themes after the podcast. It's kind of like behind the podcast. And we will explore different themes that I talked about in the real podcast, like here. I don't know where it's gonna take me, but the idea is that I can always learn something, from other people on the podcast. But maybe I can also learn something from myself, and how it forces me to ask the question, like, again, who am I? But who am I in 5 years? Who am I in 10 years? And like, what if I have 4 podcast studios? Or maybe I go international, and like, how does it feel, And I just I wanna feel it. I wanna experience it as if I was already there. I'm really at the beginning of this idea, and I think it'll be fun, and I think it's a creative way to fuck around with the podcast and see where it can take us.
And it's not about the exercise that works. It's about, like, for example, this maybe doesn't work like 100%. Also, of course, context and stuff like that. But it's not about the exercise. It's also about the talk after.
And so without further ado, here is our conversation. Let's go. Future Sander, welcome to this first episode of Behind the Firestarters podcast. Today, you are being interviewed by me, and we're going to explain why the hell there's a fucking doll sitting here in front of me. So let's clarify that. Explain to me why you're here. What is your purpose? So you could think of me as the part of you that's just standing on a small hill, looking at the path you're on from a slightly higher angle. My whole purpose is to help us pause and see the shape of what you're doing while you're in motion. In other words, I'm here to offer that reflective space so that the story you're living in doesn't just rush forward without a bit of clarity. So why do we need this conversation to happen separately from the main Firestarters podcast? I want this conversation to stand on its own because it's really a different layer of storytelling. The main Firestarters podcast is all about the conversations with guests and the journeys you're sharing outwardly. But this behind the scenes reflection is where we pause and look inward at how the whole thing is evolving. It's like giving ourselves a mirror to understand the bigger patterns that we might miss if we just keep moving forward without reflecting. Okay, that's a really interesting insight. Please do elaborate. So it's really about creating that space for clarity and perspective that we wouldn't otherwise have. So to elaborate a bit, the idea is that when we're just doing the main podcast, we're focused on the guests, the stories, and the external journey. But by stepping into this separate space, we can notice things like how our own understanding is changing over time, or how the themes we keep returning to are actually forming a bigger arc. In other words, this reflection isn't just about commentary, it's about making sense of the journey as it unfolds. And that's why having this separate layer is so valuable. It lets us slow down and really see the bigger picture. Let's talk about Future Sander specifically. Who or what are you in this conversation? Think of me as you, but just a little bit further down the road. And in this conversation, Future Sander is basically that reflective voice that's looking at what you're doing right now from a slightly elevated perspective. I'm not some distant future version of you. I'm just here to help us see the patterns and understand the shifts happening as we move forward. So I'm really just a tool to help you get a clearer sense of the story you're in. So the question I ask myself is, why look to the future at all? Why not just reflect as my present self? That's a great question. The reason we look from that little bit of a future vantage point is to give ourselves just enough distance to see patterns we can't see in the moment. When we're only reflecting as our present self, we're still right in the thick of it. But by imagining a slightly future version of you, we create a mirror that lets us step back and notice how things are evolving. It's not about predicting the future, it's just about gaining a little clarity that you might not quite get from the present alone. But how would you explain future Sander in the simplest way possible to someone who is listening for the first time? So, in the simplest possible way, I'd say future Sander is just you, but with a little more perspective. It's like having a version of you that's just a step ahead, looking back to help you see the bigger picture. That's really all it is. Okay, cool. What does this idea of the mirror of the self mean in this conversation? So, when we talk about the mirror of the self, we really mean using this conversation as a reflective tool. It's about holding up a mirror so that you can see yourself and your journey from a slightly different angle. In other words, it's not just about looking forward or looking back. It's about having a clear reflection of who you are right now and how that fits into the bigger picture. It's a way to understand the shifts and changes in a more honest and grounded way. So I'm really curious, actually, how does this mirror of the self relate to the idea of our identity changing over time? So the mirror of the self is really a way to see how your identity isn't static, it's evolving. When you look into that mirror, you're seeing the ways you've grown, the subtle shifts in how you see yourself and how your story is unfolding. It's really about recognizing that who you are is always in motion. And by having that reflection, you can better understand those changes instead of feeling like you have to be just one fixed identity. So it's a way to embrace that ongoing evolution. How does all of this reflection connect to the real actions we're taking? Basically, all this reflection helps us see why what we're doing matters. When we think about the steps we're taking, like opening the studio, we're not just doing things because we have to. We're doing them because they fit into the bigger story of what we're creating. So reflecting just helps us understand the bigger picture and makes our actions more meaningful. So what changed between Firestarters season 1 and 2 that makes this reflection especially important right now? What really changed is that season 2 makes a kind of shift from just exploring outwardly to integrating what we've learned. In other words, season 1 was about a lot of discovery and new conversations, and now season 2 is about building on that foundation and making sense of it. That's why the reflection is so important now. It helps us understand how we're evolving and what direction we're really heading in. Okay, but what is the promise to the listener? Well, the promise to the listener is really that by tuning into these reflections, they get to see how meaning is made in real time. They're not just listening to a finished story, they're actually seeing how you make sense of your journey as it unfolds. So the value is that they get to understand how to reflect on their own paths too, and they get a real honest look at how growth and shifts happen. In other words, they're getting a kind of live insight into how narrative and identity evolve. And that's pretty special. All right. So what question are you actually sitting with right now in order to close this podcast? What is something that you can tell us that we didn't already know before? The question I'm sitting with is really this. How do we stay true to the story that's actually unfolding rather than the one we think we should be telling? And that's something that I think is worth carrying forward. It's a question of authenticity and staying aligned with what's real. And I think that's the piece we can leave everyone with. All right. Future Sander, thank you so much for being here today. Absolutely. It was my pleasure. I'm glad we could have this reflective conversation and really dig into what it all means. So thanks for having me, and let's keep exploring as the story unfolds.